Welcome to this talk, which relates in some ways directly to what we're going to be doing for the rest of the semester and also next spring, but it also is a kind of very general overview to make sure that everyone kind of is up to date with some of this knowledge, and some of it is kind of historical, some of it is very factual, and a lot of it is our own predictions, our own interpretations of what is happening in the world of spatial media, immersive media, digital infrastructure, hardware, software, etc. And a lot of the stuff that we'll be showing will probably be very, very obvious to most of you. Maybe some of the more advanced stuff will be very obvious to a lot of you too. But we kind of will go through from the very basic and upwards. And we'll go quite fast, and you'll have access to this recording, and you'll have access to the slideshow. But we encourage you to take notes along the way, because we're sharing, it's about 200 slides. We have given this lecture over 3 hours once. We're going to try and do it in an hour and a half.
An hour.
And an hour, sorry. Yeah.
Actually, 50 minutes.
All right, let's get going. So as many of you know, me and Lara have worked with what's often referred to as spatial media a lot in our own practice through these virtual reality films and sculptures and installations. We also have written a ton about this, done a lot of research, we've done a lot of experiments with students. These are workshops around the world exploring what it's like to wear these things, what it's like to experiencing them, what it's like to have a meal wearing these things. We won't be talking too much about our own work today, but just to some of you who are new to the studio. So to begin, main question maybe is, what is spatial media and what is not spatial media? And obviously we might think of this sort of basic thing when we talk about spatial media, basically a media that is spatial. It's three-dimensional. We can move around in it with the help of some kind of device. These are, by the way, the ones that we have downstairs in the studio at our disposal. But maybe more importantly, to try and understand that bigger question is, what is media at large? And obviously today we think of media mainly through these sort of devices and the platforms that we use, etc. But obviously media as a word largely applies to what we now are calling legacy media, which is basically any media that predates digital media, television, radio, newspapers, etc. And throughout basically all of this history, if we first think about just the electronic, possibly digital age of media, we think of media as a flat thing. It's like a surface somewhere in a room, in our hand or on a wall, where we can perceive the media. It might be on several flat surfaces. And that has continued up until today, basically. You know, even if our phones as media devices can do all sorts of things, they're still flat things. Even if they also can mimic three-dimensional things, they are flat. But more and more, we have to start to consider media as it was a flat thing. Increasingly, we are moving into a world where media is a three-dimensional thing. So media is becoming spatial, and this is one of the kind of speculations in our work that we work with, that by the middle of the 21st century, so by 2050, most media will be spatial. So basically, you know, today you interact with media several hours a day, all of it through flat media. And by the middle of the 21st century, most of that interaction will be done through spatial media, is our speculation. But often, or you might say like, yeah, but even if you're wearing a spatial device, a lot of the actual media is actually flat. Like in these campaigns from Apple, where, wow, we can interact with 8 of these squares at the same time. They're just flat media that's just slightly curved around us. And this is a transition period, because our entire society is kind of trained on interacting with media devices that are flat. But if we look at, for instance, these very, very influential advertising campaigns from the company Magic Leap from 2016 for smart glasses, they didn't show any of this. They were projecting for a future where basically the media is the objects that you're talking about. And this is maybe slightly more what we are heading towards, and certainly more what the potential of these with this media is like, this is also an advertising campaign from Microsoft from several years ago. We can see that all of the media that we're interacting with using this tool are all three-dimensional things. So looking back,
did you share your screen optimized for video? It is looking okay, but I was just wondering.
I didn't, but I think actually it's better to do it like this. The videos are not, they're mainly GIFs and stuff like this. Thanks, Lara. And obviously also there's another thing, which is a big thing. If we just look at what's happening right now, we see all these campaigns, we maybe hear people have these headsets, maybe some of you have them. By and large, they're always used in domestic environments. They're used indoors in our private spaces. But this is something that's also slowly starting to change. I don't know if anyone who paid attention to when the Apple Vision Pro was released about a year and a half ago. We started to see these kind of funny videos, like you could use it outdoors. So people obviously started doing that, and it became this whole kind of spoof. And obviously, like you can see here, people are just kind of staring at this moron wearing ski goggles in public. But it has been a kind of dominating divide in how this spatial media is used, how often it's used, and by whom. But just to give a first brief overview over where we're heading and what's happening. So in 2020, when we were all cooped up during the pandemic, what was then called Facebook Reality Labs released this first very, very, very prototypical product called Project Aria for smart glasses or AR glasses. We'll talk about more of these definitions later on. That you can wear in public. You could wear them outside. They look kind of like normal glasses, but you could basically see through them and see a digital overlay over the world around you. One thing that's very important to notice here in terms of how things are moving is that when this was released, they were very clear with saying that you will only see people using these glasses as research glasses. They say research on the side. People wore clothes that says that this was a Facebook Reality Lab test and a research team, because they were saying it's such a kind of infringement on people's privacy, etc., because these glasses need to film everywhere around you, etc. But then very quickly, 2024, we see the first product that you can actually buy that can do this. You can just order it online and use it freely out in public from Snap Spectacles from the Snapchat company, sold as this incredible social device that you can use out in public with your friends. Then in 2024, Meta released instead what they're calling Orion, which is a prototype still, but of something similar. And then just this year, just a few months ago, now you can order and buy one of these glasses that you can, through the lens, see a digital overlay, and you can wear them in public. And all of this talk about the difficulty and the kind of struggles of society dealing with devices that are constantly filming, constantly scanning, constantly overviewing everything that's happening around, all of a sudden doesn't seem to be a problem anymore. And in these glasses, you have a kind of limited frame, but basically you can overlay any digital information over whatever you're seeing. They're kind of selling it as you could just ask the AI, what am I looking at? What is this flower? And it would just be able to highlight what you're looking at, tell you, show examples, etc. And why this matters, again, coming back to the speculation that we mentioned earlier, is that we know that many of these companies have been very open with the fact that they are all investing in this because they're projecting that these glasses will replace our phones in the coming 10 years or so, which is also why this quotes from people at Apple that's also saying the same thing. Like the reason, for instance, why the Apple smartphones, the iPhones, are no longer really evolving so much is because they're putting all of their effort into smart glasses and VR glasses as being the next computational platform out there in the world. And this is also, if some of you are curious, maybe some of you have an Apple smartphone and have already updated to the latest interface that has this thing that they're calling liquid glass. The only reason why they're doing this, like you can see here in this interface, it kind of looks like this frosted glass elements that are hovering over things that you see, is because this is a kind of interface that you need in a spatial media interface device. like where you have moments when many things are overlapping. And this is to get all of the hundreds of millions of iPhone users in the world used to using the interface that they will all eventually be using in their smart glasses or VR glasses.
Yeah, Fredrik, to emphasize on that, if you can go back, like this type of interface makes no sense whatsoever in a 2D screen, because graphically it becomes very confusing to have all these like caustics of the glass and so on. But this will make a lot of sense when you have them overlaid in space, because you want it to be something material or something that you can recognize, but something that that abstracts as little as possible. So yeah, and this has always been the Apple strategy, is to start filling in the current devices that everyone is using with the new codes, the new interfaces. So it feels very seamless when you move into the new device.
And we see in speculations like this is already 5 years old, a kind of a promo video from Facebook at the time. We're speculating on what this will look like when you can have friends that are overlaid socially in your environment and all these little pop-up windows. And this is before any of these things were properly thought of how they would be designed. And now they are actually being released onto our devices. So big question, obviously, when the entire world is seen through a digital filter controlled and owned by a corporation, who is responsible for the well-being of society? This is constantly the question that we're asking ourselves, and that these companies are not. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this incredible video from Kechi Matsuda. You'll be able to see this online. I know that now it's slightly choppy, but imagining a future society where if a neoliberal environment and a neoliberal world, capitalist world, where these devices are used by people in public, who stops anyone from overlaying commercials, advertisement, and whatever there might be, in this case, kind of exaggeration of sort of commercial nightmare of a situation? What power and opportunities do governments and citizens have to positively impact their society in this new age? Big question, and we'll be kind of trying to talk through some of these things through some examples, but first going back and looking at some overview over how we got here. So before we get back to some of these societal implications, etc. So we'll start by talking a little bit quickly about sort of the history of these things, history of these devices. How did we get here? How can we, in a sort of practical and helpful way, think about where we're heading through knowing where we have been? We can largely kind of divide in a very simplistic way this media into hardware and software. So obviously we know all the hardware, like an actual television versus the television programs, or a laptop or a smartphone versus platforms or websites, etc. And we're going to be looking through this kind of historical development, one area being the compression of information and entertainment as one kind of aim of media, and the other being immersion. Obviously, if we think of media in a very wide sense, we can go back to thousands of years when we start to look at moments when humans tries to find ways to abstract information into something that can be brought up later on, like in scripts, in text, and find ways to organize it so that it's accessible in a way, in a meaningful way, for what that information is supposed to be about. Obviously, this example is very old, but obviously we often talk about some of these important things in a European perspective. The Gutenberg Bible, the Gutenberg press being this first moment when information could be compressed in an effective way. It's not the first printing press at all. It's just in the Western world, this is something that often gets mentioned. We looked at, and we mentioned this many times now, the kind of importance of these media devices being the first ones that can compress information, and information can be transported from one place to another, like in Sergio's books. We talk about the writings of Mario Karpo, who spoke about that he created the first, through this information compression, information about how buildings are made so that it could be transported across borders. Other forms of pictorial media devices, such as tapestries that were meant to compress the history of an entire world in this case, these Swedish tapestries that kind of outlines how many different types of animals, how many animals those different families have, etc. They used to look decorative, but at this time, these were information devices. Very quickly moving on, the kind of most important and big moments. I mentioned the first photographs, important to kind of project yourself in this reality, where this would be the first time when an automated depiction of the visual world could be reproduced. Eventually also leading up to more industrial forms of reproducing information, mass producing information, creating newspapers or different devices for containing a lot of information in very, very small things, and the early forms of projectors, other early forms of photocopying machines. Of course, the television, which is only 100 years old as an invention, less than 100 years old, as a popular media device that then obviously increasingly transformed our homes, transformed culture, transformed our economies, our political structures, etc. And again, I think it's important to see just maybe how little has changed, but how important it's been, from the televisions or the screens that we have today, whether they're in our pockets or on our walls, versus these wooden objects that would have stood at the center of living rooms. But also, of course, the soft media part, the actual things we saw in the television, like one small example, but the interiors of talk shows, for instance, and how that has then kind of the compression of that information increasingly or did increasingly inform the spaces that we use. Of course, through televisions, we start to see the introduction of video games. It's a very interesting example. My favorite game map of all time, from a game cell that were the entire world is mapped out in this gigantic square that exists in two different parallel realities. Other more carry things that really had big impacts, like the Game Boy or the PlayStation. And just before we move on from this little area, I'm not going to ask you to guess here, and instead just reveal this. Usually, obviously, most people know that the gaming industry surpassed the movie industry as being the biggest entertainment industry in the world. But this is already outdated from 2022. But often people would guess that maybe both music and movie industries are smaller than the gaming industry, but very few people would guess that both of them together don't even come up to half of the economic size of the gaming industry, just to talk about where the influence of media probably comes from today, more than what we are maybe willing to think or accept. Then going back to think about the evolution of media as an immersive device, that the kind of urge to step into an imagined world. There were ideas for big projectors already in the 18th century, devices such as the stereopsis in the 19th century, where you could see a 3D image by looking at these two mirrors, the first kind of analog VR devices through these incredible stereoscopes, where basically if you put two cameras and you take a picture at the exact same time with a distance of two eyes and you print those two and you look at it like this, it looks like a 3D image. We always like to show this stereoscopic image. You can see that this is a stereoscopic image of a Victorian person sitting in the living room using one of these devices. And this is the kind of effect you would get. If you flicker between the two images like this, you can sort of see what 3D effect you would get. Probably some of you have experienced this before. But I think always one of the most interesting things historically with this image is this piece of furniture that you see in the back here. It's a kind of big wooden drawer system full of these stereoscopic images. It was in Victorian England in the colonial times like a commodity that was fought over. Like whenever a ship would come back with one of these photographers, they would be traded, they would be bought, they would be parties arranged to see the new photographs from Egypt or from China or from wherever, or from the Americas, whatever it happened to be, just to speak about the hunger for immersive media. An incredible array of different inventions. These are advertising campaigns to sell these devices. Also these zootropes where you could see moving images, or these incredible devices. These are more kind of play devices, but different attempts to be able to step into the media. This is one of the first examples where a fiction was describing these sort of devices that we have now through the Pygmalion spectacles by Stanley Weinbaum in 1930s. Before this, there's no really a description of kind of something you put over your eyes that could magically transport you to a different world. Of course, from your childhood, probably many of you have had one of these. This was like, again, a massive commodity when I was a kid.
Not in their it's
What?
fine. They didn't have one of these. Okay. Everyone was kind of laughing.
We did. Yeah, the old people here in the room did. These were big deal in the 80s, and maybe even into the 90s, with trading these little cards with different images from around the world. But gradually we start to see electronic devices that, through the work of Morton Heilig, who tried to create these sensораmas and these VR devices. This is one of his 1960s patents for a VR device. Pretty amazing to see how incredibly close it is to the VR devices we actually have now. Again, just to put into perspective that this is not a new thing at all. Like this is the first, often credited as the first AR device, the Sword of Damocles by Alan Sutherland, a researcher who built this device in the late 60s. It was called the Sword of Damocles because you had this gigantic machine hanging over your head. And it was like constantly a threat that it would fall down on your head.
And also important to mention here, or maybe you were about to say, but just in case, that all of these developments, and now we're going to show also the link to NASA, and all of these devices that were being developed in the US were funded by the military. Okay, so technology almost inescapably is always linked to military endeavors.
Yeah, a lot of this funding of these early 1990s VR devices. So again, this is a VR device. It's 1990. You could buy this thing. By and large, they were so expensive that they usually just ended up in arcades and stuff like this. But there were TV shows. People were talking about the future of VR, and this is going to revolutionize the world. This is, quite a long time ago. This person, Jaron Lanier, is credited to being the person who coined the term virtual reality, who had smart gloves where you could literally transfer your hand movements through hand tracking into a digital environment and see it through this VR devices. Again, I think they cost about $1 million each, so it wasn't a real product, but the technology did exist. And moving on, just over 10 years ago, the first kind of smart glass product was revealed. Very interesting that Google Glass, when it was revealed, they pulled the product back because there was such a societal backlash where basically people that were using these in public would be harassed and even assaulted because people were so upset at the prospect of being filmed, being documented, etc. And then 10 years later, it doesn't seem to be a problem for anyone anymore, which is kind of also important to consider. Some other important milestones in 2012, this Kickstarter was announced, which is would become the first prototype headset. This is when me and Lara started to work with this. We got one of these. It is not a very user-friendly device, had to be plugged into a computer. If you wanted to use it moving around in space, literally there were these products, an MSI laptop that was designed to be worn on your back so that you could move around through space wearing one of these devices. This is on the right, the person who launched this first product, and obviously we all recognize the doofus on the left-hand side, where they started appearing together. This person, Paul Mullucky on the right, was then, he was kind of credited as being the reinventor of VR. And this is not really spoken about much. Obviously, it's hilarious. Like, how would you convince anyone to use this with this photograph? I think that was the point of the journalist putting this on the cover of Time magazine at this point in 2014. Side note, after Paul Mullucky sold the company, he used that money to start a company that is now producing high-end weapon drones. This is him next to their best-selling product. It's literally a drone that is designed to surveil in military situations and drop bombs on people, just to kind of, again, connect this US military funding with this technology. And it's, yeah. And in 2014, at that time point, Facebook bought this company, and created this gigantic bet on this future that we're still seeing today. And just to kind of snapshot a little bit, this from 2020, where again Mark Zuckerberg said that I believe that augmented and virtual reality will be the next major computing platform in the future. So then there's extremely quick kind of crash course overview over the history of how we got here, and a little bit of a perspective that we encourage everyone to think about. Again, to summarize, this is nothing new. People have had this urge for a very, very long time. And also this military funding and capitalist drive of this technology is also not something new. And it's how we're kind of leading to the situation we're in now. Probably most of you would not need to talk about this so much, but the difference between AR and VR, AR glasses by and large is when you're looking through the glasses and you actually see the physical world with virtual things overlaid it, versus pass through, which is when cameras on your headset are filming the world around you and projecting it back onto the screen. So you're actually not seeing the real world, you're seeing a virtual version of the real world around you. But we always say that these classifications are actually quite useless to consider. They will be obsolete very, very soon. So I don't think there's, I mean, we also make the point that there's really very little point to actually keep this in mind moving forward. You will hear terms like extended reality, spatial media, XR, etc. And again, it doesn't really matter what we call it today, because they will be replaced eventually when there's some consensus of what to call these devices. Very, very quick overview over what's available now. Just mainly the point with us showing this is just to show how broad already the commercial world is around these things. These are Meta's currently available products. This is Meta's history of prototyping. This is, again, very much not something new. We're talking, over 10 years, 15 years of development of these products. Chinese company HTC Vive, which is the company that we use for all of our artworks, also has a wide range of different products that's gone through many different generations. The gaming company Valve that has developed the Index headset, which is one of the most advanced ones for gaming. PlayStation just released their second iteration of their VR headset, the PS VR 2. And then there's the Chinese company Vario, who develops these professional headsets that is used in the automotive industry and the aviation industry. And then, of course, you probably all would have seen the Apple Vision Pro, which just got a re-release now last week, which is quite groundbreaking, because it's the only time when anyone who is over 50 or anyone who doesn't care about tech would have seen this. It was all over the news. People have iPhones, and people would have seen it. And now Samsung releasing their competitor, just to give a kind of brief overview over how competitive this world already is and how ready these products are to start to replace things we do with our phones and our laptops currently. Few technical things around things like tracking and what you would often see DOF means degrees of freedom, and basically it speaks about how many freedom of movements you have in different directions. So 3 degrees of freedom means that you can move in 3 dimensions. You see there on the left on the GIF there that it doesn't matter then where you are in space, versus 6 degrees of freedom adds to 3 axes as well, not just rotational, so that where you are virtually in space correlates to where you are physically in space. Then there's also different kinds of tracking systems, outside in or inside out. In all of our work, we have always used outside in, which means that there are trackers around in the room that looks into the room and sees where the headset is and where it's pointing to position you in the virtual environment. Increasingly, we're seeing inside out, where the trackers are on the headset, and this is obviously what's required for you to be able to use these devices in any other place than your home. Here's an example of an outside in, where we see the sensors, versus outside in, sorry, and inside out on the other side, where LiDAR cameras and different cameras on the headset are scanning the environment and helping to position you in that environment. Then body tracking. There's all sorts of different ways that a physical body can be translated into a virtual environment. This will probably be very important for the project now in regards to performance. There's increasingly different tools where AI will just use the position of the headset and the position of the controllers to then estimate where the physical body is without actually knowing where it is. So if you're moving around, your AI-enhanced feet will tap dance around the environment. Most of these headsets now have hand tracking, which means that like they recognize what a hand is, and it will allow you then to use your hands inside of the virtual environment. Increasingly, this seems to be the future. These are prototypes from 2021 of EMG wristbands that are used to read the electromagnetic pulse in your wrist and transfer them into your virtual hand. And we'll talk a little bit about this in other context, but it is proven to be so accurate that it's actually more accurate as an identifier of a human being, an individual, than retina scans, than fingerprints. It takes less than a second to identify, or less than 100th of a second or something like this, to identify who it is, simply by reading the electromagnetic pulses in someone's wrists. Then there are trackers, physical trackers that you put on your body. This is also something that we have used a lot when we have done performances where you have trackers on different body parts, and where the mannequin, the virtual mannequin, then estimates where the other body parts. So like you see here that there was one on the person's belly, two on the feet and hands, and obviously the headset itself. There's none on the knees, for instance. So the movement of the knees is based on an estimation of the mannequin. And then there's motion capture suits, which is what me and Lara are using right now. Basically an entire suit that you put on that has different sensors throughout the body and out onto the fingers, etc., that does a very accurate translation of a physical body into a virtual one. And this is often what's used in performance. So this is, for instance, a Royal Shakespeare Company performance from 2021, where all of the actors were using motion capture suits, in this case optic ones, not the same as the one from the previous slide. So this is an increasingly interesting thing in performance art, and theater performance is something that we'll probably be talking more and more throughout the project. And the last thing, probably not super relevant for this project, but generally speaking of extreme importance, which is eye tracking. Because for any of these devices to truly work, it needs to know where you're looking, so that both because it needs to know what to render and what not to render. So if you're not looking at something, the computer is not actually producing visuals of that thing. It's also important because in order for these devices to be to reach a speed of user friendliness, it needs to use eye tracking in order to open things, to work with interfaces, to type, etc. Currently, this is used mainly in, again, military and in commercial property and commercial applications like advertisement, etc. Spatial audio is also extremely important as a technical and experiential component, where you see here this diagram all the way from mono sound, one speaker, stereo, higher levels like 5.1 or 7.1, all the way up to 3D audio. And the reason why this is so important for spatial media is because this is literally the way we move around the physical environment, where basically, we are very, very good, even if human hearing is not as good as many animals' hearings, but we can tell if something is far away from us. We have the ability, through what's often referred to as the cocktail effect, to cancel out and listen only to one person speaking at a party, for instance. And this is something that is now, again, technically in these companies being developed and worked on a lot to develop devices where you, for instance, can be wearing headphones in something like a bar. And if everyone is using the same devices, you can cancel out the sound that comes from only one of those devices and not the other. This is something, again, that these companies are projecting, that basically, just like you'll have smart glasses, everyone will have synchronized headphones in all the time, which again means that not just for listening to your favorite podcast or whatever, listening to your music, but so that the sound and the person you're talking to can be highlighted and other things can be taken out. A quick overview over online gatherings. So looking at instead the software part. This is a map that we looked at last semester. That's done by students of ours from previous years. And for those students of you who are new, we recommend that you go down to our studio library and look at the research book produced last year, because the students this time last year did an incredible piece of research over the beginning of the semester, looking at some of these different things, like different modes of representation. So through the avatar, through the profile, or through the character. Quite often, within this realm, we're talking about the three-dimensional 3D avatar that we see there on the right-hand side. But obviously, in this sense, we need to think about even your icon or your username being part of how you are represented inside these environments. Going back to looking more at different modes of representation. Like maybe we don't go through this so much in detail because we're already tight on time. Lara, what do you think? Should we?
Yeah, maybe no.
Let's see here.
I mean, skip these two. Synchronicity and asynchronicity is important, and then we can explain quickly network and not network. Just click ahead. 1, 2. Yep. Next. Yeah, wait a second. The previous one, maybe good to understand that I think there is a general understanding of what synchronicity and asynchronicity is, and that sometimes it can be, if it's just a few seconds, it's incredibly awkward. But if it is a few minutes, it's basically the ways in which we are very used to communicating via text messaging. But this has huge implications in the way we perceive another person as a human. And a lot of the problems that we see with bullying online, dehumanization, has to do with these degrees of removal. Okay, so huge impacts in social interaction. Next, Fredrik. Instancing is a concept that I am just going to drop it in. It might be not super well understood yet, but it's good that it stays in your minds. Every social gathering happens in worlds that can gather no more than 25 people at a technical level. It's very hard to bring more than that together into the same space, because we don't really have computers that can compute more than that smoothly yet. Okay, so most of the time you are inhabiting copies of rooms that are made on the fly as people join them. So when you think you are in the same room with a million other people, you're actually in however many thousands of copies on that room, just with a group of 25. Again, huge social implications as well.
And this is actually very important for the project that you're working on right now, because it basically means that it's actually technically impossible to bring inside a virtual environment, more than 50 or 100 people. So if you think of how many performers versus how many audience members and how they are meant to experience the performance, in many cases, have you heard of like a big concert or something with like 1 million people attending? All of those million people are split into different rooms with 25 people in each room, and then copies are made, or instances as it's called here.
Then there is also the notion of network and not network items within a world. If we are together in a social world and this remote is a networked element, if I move it, you will see it move it. But we can have things in those worlds that only I see. This also has a huge impact. We might not be seeing the same thing, and I can be moving this remote, which is a silly example, but I could be doing something else completely, which could fully impact the way we're interacting with one another, or the way that we're reading the situation, depending on that being a network or a non-networked element.
We'll skip this and move to, just wanted to mention briefly, this is thankfully less and less a term that gets mentioned. Always you've heard of the term metaverse, and it's again a kind of loosely defined term that's meant to encapsulate the kind of collective of all virtual environments together. It comes from this novel from 1992 called Snow Crash. So it's like many examples. When you look at these things, the wording comes from science fiction, and basically a hypothetical iteration of the internet. And this term, as we always said, and that it's a buzzword that's used to commercially try and sell products. Thankfully, this term didn't tag on, and we have never used it. We instead used the term immersive internet for various reasons. Again, that it doesn't connect with this kind of very male-centric science fiction writing, and instead it uses terms that already connects to the internet as we have it today. Quick overview of, obviously, there are a lot of different platforms. This is something that was looked into quite a lot last semester again. They organize themselves differently. They use assets very differently. In some cases, they have very commercially heavy platforms, like a case like Mozilla Hubs, completely non-profit and open source, versus, again, many of them that are very, very commercially driven companies that are listed on stock markets. Huge IP products, etc., but where you can socially interact with others through different uses of avatars, etc. Many of them are also increasingly not using spatial dimensions, but social dimensions, like this game with this example where Gather Town, where you're walking around in a 2D kind of environment. And of course, the avatars then look completely different. How you're represented is also extremely different. We won't be talking too much about this in this example, but this is something we'll talk more about also in the spring semester, this concept of virtual twins of cities, which we have a diploma student right now who is dealing with this concept, which basically is an idea that in order to effectively manage a city, this is the kind of positive way to describe it, the things that happens in that city need to be digitally translated into a virtual copy of that city in order to gather data and then be able to make ideally intelligent decisions of what to do with that data and how to then improve that city. So like bus timetables or trash collection or traffic or other forms of interaction, etc.
But that then will most likely turn into even heavier surveillance mechanisms for most likely oppressive systems.
Yeah, exactly. And this connects obviously also to something that probably a lot of you have used in offices, building information modeling, BIM, because in many places in the world, BIM models are now legally required when you submit for planning permission, which basically means that the city will have access to BIM models increasingly for all the buildings in the city. And this is the kind of goal, so that not only can things like bus timetables be monitored, but even the mechanical functions of buildings themselves, like the nervous system of buildings, like how much air is used, how much AC, how much electricity, which floors are used, where are lights on, where are lights not on, etc. Again, speaking maybe for more of this surveillance that we'll talk about later on. Examples, again, of things like temperature being monitored, etc. Also something that we'll speak more about in the spring semester, GIS, Geographic Information Systems, which connects to the larger out of the city scale of monitoring and creating virtual twins. And this is something that is less and less used as a term. It was a massive buzzword about 10, 15 years ago, the Internet of Things, which now if you buy a washing machine, you have to disable the Wi-Fi function if you don't want your washing machine to transmit the information of how you wash your clothes to this central cloud, which again connects to this idea that all information in society has to be monitored, collected, so that that data can be used.
And it's a good moment maybe to like notice how a buzzword comes up, it feels like it fails or disappears, and then it's seamlessly and without us noticing fully embedded into our day-to-day lives. And we just accept it as almost a non-technology, no? Technology is fully integrated into your lives when you don't think about it as technology anymore. And with so many of these things, they just happen. The Internet of Things like crawled into our homes like cockroaches through it's impossible to buy a new washing machine without Wi-Fi. Twin cities are integrated into government systems through software. No, BIM software becomes mandatory as per government mandate. and through that you are contributing to the building of the twin city that eventually could also become the system of control. And the social VR worlds are seeping through entertainment. A lot of these platforms for social VR are now catering to not just children, but to parents through making it appealing and safe, quote unquote safe, for children to game within these platforms because they have all these possibilities to set boundaries, and it's true, they are probably quite nice environments to play in, and they are more physical. But notice how through so many areas of everyday life, through so many branches, technology is making its way through. And the reason why we're talking about this and giving these talks and even having this studio is, yes, it's interesting to play around with these technologies sometimes, but even more so, it's important to be totally frightened of this, and be on top of it and understand, hey, what decisions am I making and how can I work with this, or how can I raise awareness of these issues, or how can I even counter them?
Yeah.
I think these are some things that come up now as well, but just a quick that.
And the final part of the talk here, we'll talk about the future, but before that also is something that we will not talk so much about today, but obviously AI implications in immersive media is going to be huge. These are some of the main things that's going to happen. 3D content prompting, like many of you have been using AI to create images or 3D models for your asset libraries. This is something that will eventually be possible to be used in VR, so you can use a VR headset or an AR headset and just speak what you want to be manifested in front of you, and AI will just manifest it the way that we see more and more now. AI agents as NPCs or non-player characters, there will be many examples of virtual environments where you don't meet any humans, but you can actually have conversations around you. They're just AI agents. Or AI-enhanced socialization, which is increasingly also happening with people wearing little headphones and asking the AI for advice for social interaction. Obviously, if you're using an avatar, it's harder to see if you're also looking at a different screen, if you have a different interface, where a lot of social interaction will be enhanced by asking advice from AIs, and also about avatar body language and facial expressions. So now to end, a few slides on kind of both future speculations, different ideas, societal implications, etc. Video calls will transform into immersive gatherings, having an impact on the layout of the home and the travel to work areas of the city. VR technology and experiences are in their fax machine era. So how we don't use fax machines anymore, but they were all over the world at some point. Esports and the multiplayer online role-playing games are the reference for this virtual sociality and where it's headed. As we said before, by the middle of the 21st century, most media will be spatial. Media will be persistently mapped over physical environments, both private and public. So geolocated all around the world. Will be many different layers of virtual environments that are persistently mapped to that space and time. Wearable tech can lead to this disappearance of physical public infrastructure and civic services. This is a concept that's sometimes referred to as the dark city, because if the speculations are true, that the smartphones will gradually be phased off, and just like everyone has a smartphone, everyone will have smart glasses. It means that even the illumination of public spaces, like literally street lights, might not be needed in the next 30 years, because the illumination of the world around us could be done through computation and through the world that we're seeing. So we might see street lights disappearing, we might see advertisement disappearing, or even street signs at large, where all of that information, like a kind of red-green light crossing of a street, is potentially going to be virtual in the next 30 to 40 years instead. Teleportation infrastructure is mobility infrastructure. Teleportation, the way we read about it in science fiction, is the way we move around the internet currently. In this sense, the browser is the virtual street. And if we think of spatial media instead, teleportation, literally moving yourself magically to a different place, becomes like a new mobility infrastructure. We wrote 10 propositions a few years ago that we won't be reading out now, but that we'll be coming back to later on about the future of virtual architecture. Looking now at some of the societal implications in a few different categories. Firstly, surveillance and control. Some of you might be familiar with the London Ring of Steel, which is a physical surveillance barrier around the city of London where the financial district is. It's invisible to us. You can't really see it, but basically this was built during the IRA bombings in London, where basically it's possible to, within 1 minute, seal off this entire area of the city of London just through little barriers, little bollards, etc. And it's a kind of surveillance system that has huge implications on the public physical space, but something that's not visible to us. And I think it's, again, important to look at the history of what these companies are saying and really never trust what they're saying. This is something they said in 2020, never surprise people, provide controls that matters, consider everyone, put people first. Obviously, this has been proven in the last 2 years that this is absolutely just something that they are not believing in at all. Some examples of kind of, again, how we should be and need to be suspicious of these companies. This also from 2020, I think. We're talking about the ability to personally identify some proved that it's possible to very, very accurately identify an individual through the use of just the way you move the controllers. And they released a paper, etc. And then this tweet popped up that someone from Meta said that, like, I wish we could publish our research because we have known this for many years, that this is possible. Just again to speak about the kind of what these companies are doing and how far ahead they are is something that we're also completely unaware of. There are also ideas such as this developed by Britton Heller, a way to identify individuals through their biometric data that is used in these devices. There's also movements such as the neuro rights movement, like when devices are increasingly seeing what you're looking at, they might be knowing your heartbeat, etc. So there are movements to create basically a kind of guiding principle that ideally will become part of constitutions eventually, where our thoughts and our interior life and our minds themselves actually like has rights, where the barrier into a person's mind has a legal boundary. There are also ideas such as SSI, or self-sovereign identity, which is a movement to try and create a public way to identify individuals. This is something that the EU is working on to try to, this is coming from the world of banking, but increasingly as we start to use these devices where we are appearing as avatars, etc., more and more, we need a kind of public way to be able to identify who is who, so that your rights can actually be enforced. Because if you cannot identify who you are, again, you cannot carry whatever rights you might have with you. The idea of digital colonialism is the replication of early colonialist infrastructure projects today in the form of digital networks and connectivity infrastructure. Also something important to consider. We won't go into too much detail today, but many countries and governments around Europe are talking about a form of digital colonialism, given the fact that almost exclusively all of these companies and platforms comes from the United States. Another form of societal implications, which is huge, is accessibility, and this is not something new again. This is incredible research done by Robbie Cooper over about 20 years ago, where Robbie Cooper went to found people in social gaming environments and got to know them, and eventually went to see them and speak to them in person. This is an example of someone who, because of disabilities, cannot leave their domestic environments, etc., but lives an incredibly vibrant social life in these virtual environments, where the ability to change your appearance, etc., completely changes, where like who we are physically might not at all have to do with who we are virtually. Also, the actual body that we use inside these environments do not have to be even humanoid. This is an example we see here up in the ceiling, this kind of snake-like rainbow thing. You will encounter avatars that has nothing to do with the human body. There's also the problem of VR motion sickness that researchers only showing now that it's affecting women more than men, and it's people say that it's increasingly difficult to know why this is, which obviously also speaks for the lack of research into thinking about a diverse group of users. And when it comes to accessibility, also there are also a lot of dimensions in design, which has to do with the proximity of your avatar versus other avatars. And many companies came up with this idea of this personal bubble, where basically if an avatar approaches you within your private bubble, then you become invisible to try to halt harassment, etc. And then finally, as a kind of point on this, there's also an increasing amount of intimacy in VR, especially in a platform called VR Chat, where cuddling and the different worlds are built around physical interaction of mainly younger users, where they describe this thing that they call phantom touch, which is basically like something that most VR users can easily experience. If someone reaches out and touches you from avatar to avatar, it can feel so real that your mind actually produces the physical sensation of being touched. There's also ERP, erotic role play, which is increasingly something that platforms like VR Chat is one of the main uses for many, many young people, where like literally sex in these environments is something that's increasingly becoming more and more common. And then maybe finally a few notes on societal implications on relating spatial media and physical space. Before COVID, this was something huge, especially in China, but also in Europe and the US, where basically every mall were either projected to have or already had a VR arcade or VR arena. During COVID, basically all of these projects got canceled and they kind of never came back. All these businesses were closed for such a long time. And it's increasingly becoming something that's used again in domestic environments and as an individual share. And obviously, this is increasingly getting solved through pass-through, etc. But this is an incredible image that we often use, because this is like material produced by the company to describe how, like, when you're using these headsets, you're essentially blindfolded, so you need to pay attention to your environment. And they show an adult looking at a child who's looking up at an adult who has their eyes covered and who is present in a different reality. I mean, for us, this is like the most dystopic image ever produced. Again, to put in perspective how kind of detached many of these companies are. But essentially, these companies, they produce these sort of videos that are helping you to think about how to use your home, to use the spatial devices. You draw up these boundaries so that you don't run into your furniture. They also produce this kind of, again here, like you have this kind of fence around you so that you don't hit a wall or these things which people seem to do anyway all the time. Or these kind of promotional videos, again, from, at that point, Facebook, where this idea that like you could put on a headset and be transported into a shared sofa where you're here sitting next to a person who is physically somewhere else, but your two virtual bodies are sharing a sofa. Both people are sitting down, in this case, watching a basketball game, whatever random stuff they put together in these videos. And this is something that will transition into what Lara will be talking about the next phase. This is a project that's called a Ven Room, and a term that we kind of invented a few years ago to describe what happens when two people are using spatial media in two different domestic environments, and they are meeting through their avatars, and part of their domestic environment is coming with them and overlapping into that new space, like a Venn diagram, which basically then speaks for a kind of idea of a global home or a global village where all of our domestic environments are scanned by these devices, and so that we can have the social interactions, these objects then gets transferred into a shared digital world of and this is a video that was produced again by Facebook a few years ago, where they were very proudly speaking about how these devices, they will scan the environment around you and make a digital version of that scan, and keep it on file, so that when you turn on your device again, in this case in your office, the device knows what a desk is, what your laptop is, what your screen is, etc. And in Meta's their last terms of conditions for the use of these devices, basically what you're doing is, if you allow the device to scan your environment so that you can use it for gaming or for entertainment, whatever it is, the rights to scan of your home, you've just signed away in perpetuity for Meta, put into perspective, and maybe on a sort of pessimistic point. But again, we just cannot emphasize enough how critical devices and tools are used and the motivations behind them.
Yeah,